So it's time to make our next app, which is going to be a simple database storing contact details, but it's going to be using a content provider. So the idea for this app is to focus on the content provider specific functionality and not necessarily the Android Lollipop stuff, because you really need to understand a content provider in order to use more complex things in Android. So as I've said, we're going to be using a content provider with the app. So what I want to do before we get into the coding is just look at the differences between regular database coding and using a content provider for our database access. So firstly, without a content provider, this is the scenario. So we've got our application and it accesses Java database code, which you've seen a couple of examples of that so far. And then it talks directly to the SQLite database, which in turn updates the relevant tables. So that's really the sort of flow through without using a content provider. So we'll contrast that to using a content provider. And we've got a mechanism there. We've got the content provider has now slotted itself in between our application and the Java database code itself. So in other words, your application doesn't necessarily understand or know what the Java database code is and doesn't directly talk to the Java database code. So you could sort of say that the content provider is sort of like a proxy in that it doesn't do the work itself. What it does, it sort of puts its hand up and says, yes, over here, I can update that database for you. But when you call that relevant functionality, as we saw in the previous app that we created using the content resolver, it then passes on the call to the relevant code to do the work. So in the case of the Google contact system that we used, you obviously only called the content resolver and sort of said, I want a list of names, and it went off. The content provider knew where to look, so to speak, to find the code to retrieve that for you. So we didn't have to write any code to access the context SQLite database directly, and that's because the code was already written by the content provider that Google provided for us, and it went off and called the relevant bit of code. All we need to know is use a content resolver to access the code. So there's a big difference there between the two. So what we're doing is in our app that we're creating, we're going to be doing both parts. So we're going to be creating the Java database code because that's not written yet. So we need to write that. But then we're also going to be adding a content provider in front of it. And of course, the advantage with that is our application will be able to use this database, but also other applications will be able to as well. So again, just to be clear on the differences between a content resolver and a content provider, you can see in the scenario in the last app that we created, the very simple app, this is effectively what happened. We created the application, we used a content resolver, which used a URI to access the data, in this case, the Google contact or the Android contacts system. So we accessed the data via that content provider using a content resolver to find where to go to get that information. So the question now is, what is a URI? Well, a URI stands for a Uniform Resource Identifier. Now, it's a string of characters used to identify a name of a resource. Now, regular HTTP links on the internet are URIs, but URIs are used to identify and URLs are used to locate. So in other words, all URLs are URIs, but URIs can be other things as well, and we're going to be using the URI in a different capacity than a regular URL, which we'll see shortly. So let's just go through the format of a URI specific to the content provider. And this is what we will use to get access to our content provider. We use the first word is content. So it's content : // then there's an authority, / there's a path, and another / and an ID. So that's really the format, the general format of using a URI pertaining to content providers. Now the thing is, if you have a URI that's prefixed by content : // the Android device will know that this is not a regular URL. So in other words, it doesn't go out onto the internet to try and resolve that. It looks locally in its sort of database, in its system, to find a content provider that's on the device. So that's what the content : / does effectively. Now breaking down the content provider URI, the authority, now this is like the major ID for the content provider. So this is sort of the high level sort of, who owns this package, if you will. So in this case, I could put, if I had an app, I could use content : / com.timberchowka.app name, and that would be the obviously the com.timbachauca.app name. That's the authority. So by using that, we can guarantee that a content provider is unique on the device, and that tells Android where to start looking, so it knows to look in that app that's on that device in order to find that content provider. The next component is the path. Now that's a name that points usually to a table in the database, or a file if we're not using SQLite. So that's sort of the next level down. So the previous authority was the overall look. This is the name of the app effectively that's been set up to use the content provider. Breaking that down a little bit further, path is what type of data from that app do we want to use. For example, we might want to use the contacts table from the app that we've just talked about. So if that's the case, we would append /contacts to our URI for the content provider. So you can see on the screen there, content : /com.timbachauca.appname /contacts would be sent using a content resolver to our content provider, saying this is what we want to access. The contacts is what we want to access. So again, in this example, that would be an indication we want to access the contacts table in SQLite. And the last component is the ID. This is where you want to point to an individual row or record in the table. So that would be in a case where you wanted to edit an existing record, edit an existing person, for example, in the contacts database, a contacts table, I should say. You would pass the ID. So it's a case of really wanting to break it down to work on a single record. Now it is a lot more powerful. You might be thinking, well, hang on, this is a bit powerful. Can I only use one table at a time? It is a lot more complex and more powerful than what I've mentioned, but this is just a general idea of the content provider URI. So don't think that this means that you can access only one table at a time. That's not the case, because what happens is when you're developing the content provider code, you sort of parse or you read in the content provider URI that's been passed to the process, and from there you can decipher what the calling process wants to do. But this will make more sense once you see the actual app working. All right, so let's check it out. Now you know a lot more about content providers, content resolvers, URIs. Let's start developing our app in the next video. So I'll check you out in that video.